the newsagents.
Today, the Office for Budget Responsibility forecasts that because of changing international factors and the measures I take, the UK will not now enter a technical recession this year.
That was the Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, in the spring budget of last year, delighted that the UK was not going into recession. Except we did. We have. We are. Today's figures show that the UK economy has now fallen into a recession, GDP falling by 0.3%, larger than pretty much anyone had forecast.
The R word, recession, is scary for everybody, but it's even scarier for politicians, especially politicians who are staring down the barrel of a general election in 6 to 8 to 10 months' time. With a recession now here, and who knows how long it will last, is it really all over for the Conservative Party? Welcome to the newsagents.
It's Emily.
It's Lewis.
And here is the Chancellor today explaining exactly what's happened to us.
We always expected growth to be weaker while we prioritise tackling inflation. That means higher interest rates. And that's the right thing to do because you can't have long-term healthy growth with high inflation, but also for families when there's a cost of living crisis, when the cost of their weekly shop is going up, their energy bills are much higher. It's the right thing to do. The underlying picture here is an economy that is more resilient than most people predicted. Inflation is coming down. Real wages have been going up now for 6 months.
I'm really struggling to understand what he's actually saying there. Is it right to go into recession? Has he taken us into recession? Or is he suggesting that actually it's all going to be okay because now we're in recession, we're going to end up with interest rates coming down, which is going to help in the long term? But that doesn't really explain why we've got into recession. And why is he trying to spin it as if it was a really successful move?
Yeah. I suppose what he's saying is that the recession is to some extent an inevitable outcome of having much higher interest rates. And that was the cost that you have to pay in order to get inflation down. But there's a much bigger story here, which is that, just to return to the actual figures, the UK economy shrank by 0.3% in the last quarter of 2023. That is worse than anyone forecast. Most people thought it would be 0.1%. The economy, therefore, grew by an absolutely minuscule, basically a rounding error of 0.1% overall in 2023. That is worse than the Eurozone, who aren't doing particularly well either, and the United States, who are doing much better. And crucially, when you dig beneath the figures and you look at, because it's all very well talking about the overall size of the economy, i.e. GDP, what really matters is GDP per capita or GDP per person. If you look at that, then output per head fell by 0.7% for the year and hasn't grown since the first quarter of 2022. We are in, look, these figures could be revised slightly. It might turn out that we're not in a technical recession. The big overall story today is that our economy is stagnating, has been stagnating for years. Living standards have been stagnating and getting worse. And there is no sign whatsoever of it getting much better anytime soon.
Yeah. And I think that whole question of, well, obviously we've been trying to bring inflation down, that's why we're into recession, is answered very simply, or not very simply, but certainly is countered with the argument that the Eurozone hasn't, right? We still have a higher inflation and we're in recession, and they don't have as higher inflation and they're not in recession, right?
Yeah.
So,
well, some countries are, but overall,
not
Germany is, but
okay. So Japan recession, we know that Germany's in recession. I think France is also flatlining as well. So it's not that we are doing something that nowhere else, that none of Europe's doing, but we are certainly politically faced with pretty unpalatable choices because we've got a Prime Minister now who's promising to bring growth up and taxes down. And that sounds as if it can't actually be done without cutting public services. Because we haven't brought inflation down. It's still at 4%. It's double what the Bank of England's target is set at. I also think that when we were talking about, and I hate this word technical recession because for most people, nobody cares whether it's a technical or a non-technical recession. It's a recession if it's hurting us in the way that is stopping us growing. And most people were predicting that we would be just slightly behind a 0.1% shrinking, and we are shrinking by 0.3%. And the point that the Labour Party has been making is that given that Rishi Sunak became Prime Minister on the promise of growing the economy, every single quarter since he has been the Prime Minister, we have seen the economy shrink. It is not something that's just happened. It is not something that's just happened since December. We have not grown the economy since, I think, February of 2022, despite, let's just remind you here, of those 5 pledges of Rishi Sunak.
5 promises. We will halve inflation, grow the economy, reduce debt, cut waiting lists and stop the boats. Those are the people's priorities. They are your government's priorities, and we will either have achieved them or not. No tricks, no ambiguity. We're either delivering for you or we're not.
It's funny, isn't it, how you suddenly hear the or not in
Yeah,
a much more meaningful way. No tricks, you're absolutely right. No ambiguity, you're absolutely right. We didn't deliver.
Well, I mean, if you just like mark his homework on that, I mean, the only one you can say he has unequivocally met is to halve inflation, which is the one which was the easiest to meet and the one over which actually he has least control. Grow the economy is now in recession. Reduce debt, well, that's to be TBC, but given the way that Hunt has been reducing taxes, probably not, or at least not for many, many years. Cut NHS waiting lists, no, because that's elective waiting lists have been rising. And stop the boats, they're still coming, albeit in a slightly reduced number to where they were before. So, Sunak made a lot of quite simple promises, and simply put, most of them he just hasn't met.
Meanwhile, Rachel Reeves this morning went on the attack, the offensive, and she did so in a press conference. Now, she could have just delivered a speech, she could have gone on the media rounds, she could have put out a sort of, Labour statement, but instead you had this very visual demonstration of Labour trying to be on the front foot. And actually, I mean, I sort of encourage you to look at the footage if you haven't seen it read this morning, because she stands in a room that looks like the kind of place that Boris Johnson gave his sort of COVID updates from. And she is flanked by 2 massive Union Jack flags. Now, I know we do not measure our politicians on the size of their flags, but if there was one statement
I do.
That you do,
I do,
Lewis,
all the time.
Who is scraping along the bottom at the moment for you?
I mean, Trump's flags are enormous.
Enormous.
I mean, unbelievably
power,
large.
isn't it?
It really is. It really is.
But I sort of think it does speak to something which says, when we don't think of ourselves like the opposition anymore, we think of ourselves as Britain. This is Britain. We've got our Union Jack flags, we've got our podium, we've got our oak panelled room, and we're going to kind of stand there looking to all intents and purposes like they're already in power, right? I mean, there was something sort of slightly, I think, discombobulating about that moment where you'd sort of had a clip from the Chancellor, you'd had a clip from sort of Rishi Sunak the night before, but the first speech of the day came from the Shadow Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, and this is what she said.
Let me start by saying that this is deeply worrying news for families struggling to make ends meet and for businesses too. These are provisional figures. They may change, but it is absolutely clear that Britain remains trapped in a spiral of economic decline.
She's completely correct about that. I mean, if you look at where the economy, this is a long story, not just over the last 2 years, if you look at where the economy would have been if it had kept growing at the same rate since 2008 as it did before, then the whole economy would be roughly a quarter as larger than it currently is. And although that can sound a bit kind of nebulous and amorphous, just think of it this way. It would be an extra £23,000 or so per household in this country, in everybody's pocket.
It's like 140 billion, isn't it?
It's an enormous figure. And that is the long-term story of Britain's economy. We have basically been stuck in a period of almost endless stagnation and decline. But it does pose problems for Labour as well, which is that everyone can agree, everyone can see that Britain's economy, a bit like some other European economies as well, it isn't just Britain, but Britain's economy has struggled, and it has struggled to achieve the sort of productivity growth and economic dynamism that it used to have. So you've got to, therefore, everyone can agree on the diagnosis. What's the prescription? If you agree that you need radical change, what is Labour's radical change? Well, funnily enough, of course, just last week, Labour retreated from its most radical, its most innovative bit of economic policy, i.e. the £28 billion a year. Now, you can have an argument as to say whether that's the right thing, whether it was too much money, and so on. But it is true to say that in terms of economic policy, beyond some stuff about planning and other things here and there is right now not an enormous amount or enormous space between the Conservative and Labour parties. So if this election is about how we reverse economic decline, will one political party stand up and give us some ideas?
Yeah. So what Rachel Reeves is saying is she's basically taken the pound sign off what they want to do now. She's saying it is the GB Energy Plan, the Great British Energy Plan to grow the economy. She's saying the Green Prosperity Plan is still there. But I think you're right, you put your finger on it, which is there is a reluctance to be really, truly ambitious. And it's not like one person has said we need growth and nobody else agrees. Everyone knows we need growth. Liz Truss, it's the one thing she got right. We need growth. Every politician that's come anywhere near power or shadow power has said we need growth. And so I guess the thing is, if what the Conservatives have landed us after 14 years is a reduction in the size of our economy, then presumably whatever you're bringing in next has got to be the opposite of that, has got to be something that involves a big, dramatic plan for change. And that's exactly what Labour did have until last week. They were going to borrow to invest. They were going to spend in the same way, we've talked about it before, as Joe Biden, the Democrats, have done with a big economic infrastructure project, which means investing more into public services, into the economy, into the green economy by borrowing first. They're too scared to do that now, or they don't want to admit they're going to do that now. And I guess if you are a potential Labour voter, you fall into two camps. The camp that thinks, oh, they're just saying that, but once they're in power, they will do it. Or you're in the camp that says, I don't know if I really trust them with the economy. I don't want them to screw things up. I don't want them to go and, spend too much. So I'll give them my vote on the basis that they're not going to do that. And we don't yet know, I think, whether their ambition will be matched once they or if they get to power. But let's just listen to Rachel Reeves answering the question of why she keeps calling it Rishi's recession when it could shortly be Rachel's recession.
Well, first of all, Rishi Sunak has been been Prime Minister now since October 2022. And in every quarter, since he's become Prime Minister, the economy is now smaller than when he came to office. And of course, one of his 5 pledges was to grow the economy. We now know he's failed to achieve this and the economy is going backwards. This is his recession. He promised to grow the economy and he has failed. Unlike this Prime Minister and this Chancellor, Keir Starmer and me have got a real plan, a concrete plan for growth. And don't just take our word for it, take the word of the businesses who have helped us devise these plans.
Yeah, look, and I think that clip really sums up exactly what we were just saying, which is that again, to go back to Liz Truss, I mean, she wasn't wrong about the fact that we are in a kind of, I think, it was clear, is a kind of late 1970s style moment when it is clear that the UK economy needs some radical medicine in order to recover from this long period. And to be honest, what is currently in the Labour plan, I mean, yeah, you can do a bit of planning reform here, you can unlock pension funds. These are important things, but they are not going to realise much for quite a long time. And the question is right, which is this is currently the Conservatives' problem. It could quite easily become Labour's problem. In the meantime, though, it does pose 2 particular problems, I think, for the Conservatives and for the government. One is policy and one is political. Start with the political one. What has the Conservative line been and the Sunak kind of line been in the last few weeks and months? It has been, don't let Labour take you back to square one. Now, that is a hard bit of messaging to land at a time when not only that, as we've said before, that lots of voters think, I actually quite like the sound of square one, but also you're in a recession.
We're negative.
We're negative. We're already,
we're
in minus 15 or something. It feels like their political messaging and their economic messaging are just not in alignment. We heard that in the clip from Hunt at the very start when he says, we've turned a corner. How can you say we've turned a corner when we've literally just gone back into recession? And the other problem is a policy one, which is obviously we're a few weeks away from the spring budget. There's been this trail and suggestion and idea that they're going to try and cut taxes again. This will make the Chancellor's room for manoeuvre fiscally even tighter, because the OBR will look at the figures and say, well, perhaps the recession is that little bit more deeper, or the contraction is a little bit more deeper than we thought. It won't make a huge difference, but it does make a difference.
Yeah, because borrowing costs have gone up. And we know that when the Chancellor last announced tax cuts, that meant essentially we were going to lose, what was it, about £20 billion of headroom from public services. Now, he would counter that and say, stop looking at it as a cut to public services.
He did say that to you, as I remember.
I think he did.
Quite literally
He said, oh, stop being so left-wing about it. It's not a cut to public services. It is an investment in growth. Now, OK, you can say it's early days, but if what he's done is landed us tax cuts, but we are still seeing no growth, I think at some point you have to say cuts to public services are not the answer to a recession, because all that happens is all of us are going to get poorer and we're not going to have the services we need to fall back on to support us. So I guess the question now is, why is he talking about more tax cuts and potentially more cuts to public services when we're in this mess already? And yes, you can make possibly a political argument that that's the route out he thinks is best by trying to grow it, but it doesn't seem to be working in practice, and it might even be a foil to stop everyone else talking about the recession itself if we're all sort of looking forward to the next thing, which is more tax cuts. We're going to speak now to Sky's economics editor, Ed Conway, who puts this in context for us and actually is quite sanguine about whether any of the political parties could have got us out of this, given where we are with the Ukraine war. Ed, just talk us through what the figures are actually telling us, rather than sort of getting stuck to decimal places. Just talk us through what we have now learned.
So first of all, we're technically in recession. And again, what's the definition of recession? It's somewhat arbitrary and you can get fixated on these things. But basically, the economy shrank in the final 2 quarters of the year. And that means we're less well off. But if you kind of take a step back and look at the more important picture, which is how that growth is actually dispersed between different people in the country, which is kind of a better sense of your living standards, you need to look at something called GDP per head or GDP per capita. And all you're doing there is just literally dividing that economic output. And when we talk about economic output, that's just the amount of money that we're all generating across the economy. Just divide that by the number of people. And of course, the number of people is going up because immigration's gone up for the most part. And when you do that calculation, then actually the economy shrank by 0.7% in 2023 and actually has been shrinking since the start of 2022. And that's the longest period of shrinking GDP per capita, which, like I say, is definitely a better measure of the economy and how well off we're all feeling. That's been shrinking for at least 2 years now. So that's not a particularly positive economic story. But if you just look at the headline figures, it's kind of flatlining. So either flatlining or shrinking.
You mentioned immigration there, which is really important. I mean, normally, at least in overall GDP terms, you would expect, wouldn't you, with immigration at the levels that it's been, GDP overall, if not per capita, to be heading up and to be growing a little more strongly than where we are. So when you consider how high immigration has been, to still be in a situation where overall GDP numbers are declining is quite something. It's
quite something. And I normally you would expect the economy, normally has to go in inverted commas here, but you'd expect the economy to be growing by maybe 2%. Economists talk about kind of trend growth. So, maybe that used to be 2.5%. These days, perhaps it's 2%, perhaps it's 1.5%. Either way, it is a really, really long way from where we are right now. And so the best that you can say is that the economy is stagnating. The worst that you can say is that when you look at the kind of broadest measures of our living standards, it is shrinking, and it has been shrinking for quite some time. And that really is the most honest picture here. It is depressing. It is a depressing picture for the economy. And, the last time we saw GDP per capita doing what it's doing right now was back in the last recession. I mean, leaving aside the COVID pandemic. So when this stuff happens, it feels recessionary. And so we can kind of debate for a long time whether this is technically a recession or not. But the big picture is we are not doing well at all as an economy. And it's worth just saying, it's not just the UK. There's much of Europe is facing very similar problems right now, but it's definitely a problem for the UK.
Would you see, Ed, in anything that either the Labour or Conservative Party is saying that matches the kind of gravity of the economic situation that we're in, have been in, and are likely to be in for some time?
Well, it's all politics at the moment, isn't it? Because it's Rachel Reeves is trying to take ownership of this, show that it's the Tories' kind of mistakes that have led to this. But in practice, it's hard to pinpoint anything in particular that is responsible for quite such a big part of the fall in GDP per capita. Yeah, you can look at like Brexit and say that's definitely taken something off GDP. You can look at some of the other policy measures. But for the most part, what has happened here is we as a country are poorer. We're considerably poorer than we were a couple of years ago. And why are we poorer? For the most part, I mean, Brexit's a little part of it. You've got, perhaps the fact that you don't have high investment and people are nervous right now. You've got the cost of living crisis. But the big part of the explanation is we are poorer because we are a big importer of energy. And that energy has just become so much more expensive because of what's happening in Ukraine. And that just blows everything else away. And we are facing that. The rest of Europe is facing that. But it's a steamroller of an economic problem. And I don't see much, to be honest with you, that any of the political parties are talking about that can really resolve that. And part of the problem is that when you're faced with that kind of a situation, it's an adjustment in your standard of living, and we have just had to adjust, like it or not, go from one level to a lower level. And we are all poorer as a result. And that's what you see in these numbers. And I don't see much in any of the policy proposals that we've heard from either of the parties or many people at all that could resolve that.
So basically you're saying it's not a Tory problem, it's not a Labour problem, it's a UK problem. And you can't actually see a way out.
Europe. It's UK, it's Europe, it's Germany as well, it's France too. I'm not saying that there's certain things which could have made things worse or indeed improved things at the margin in this country. And, Brexit is the one that people like to point to. And definitely that has put friction in the wheels of trade and hasn't made things any better and might have slightly contributed to higher inflation. However, when you look at the big pie chart of where our higher inflation and indeed the lower living standards has come from, the vast majority of that is higher energy. And we are all wrestling with that right now. And the reason that America isn't wrestling with it at the moment, they see pretty strong growth in America, is that they have enormous reserves of gas. Fracked gas, like it or not, and oil has helped America get through this in a way that Europe and Japan, for that matter, and, the UK have not. And I think it's depressing because it's not like, if you're being really, really honest, you can point to a different scenario where the UK would have had blistering growth. We just wouldn't have, because it's the Putin story. And I think that's what we're not talking about enough at the moment. It's turned into a game of politics. Of course it has. We're coming up to an election. This is really depressing. And also, foolishly, Rishi Sunak pledged that he was going to get the economy growing this year. And that has not happened. He has broken that pledge. You can kind of again, go into decimal places about that. But when I look at it, he's basically broken that pledge. But leaving the politics aside, we are poorer as a nation. And what we are seeing now is the statistical evidence of that actually starting to appear.
Ed Conway, thank you so much. Really helpful.
Cheers, Ed.
Not at all.
Now, look, nobody in politics in this country wants a recession. But I guess what you can say is that politically, for Labour, it's taken the heat off what was sort of turning out to be a pretty tough week, or started out as a tough week, following the suspension of not one but two parliamentary candidates over anti-Israel stroke anti-Semitic comments. Rachel Reeves was asked about that briefly, and after that question she gave a sort of curt answer and then wrapped up the whole press conference. But one person, one Labour figure, was brave enough to go and bear it out. This is the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, on Sky News this morning.
I'm only going upon what I've read in the media, so I've not seen the transcripts, but as far as I'm concerned, that sort of language isn't acceptable, and it certainly shouldn't be acceptable in a party like mine that is proud to be both anti-racist but also anti-Semitic.
Sorry, no, let's just check that again. Just play the tape back.
That sort of language isn't acceptable, and it certainly shouldn't be acceptable in a party like mine that is proud to be both anti-racist but also anti-Semitic.
Lots of people nodding along at this point,
no,
saying,
Sadiq.
Well done, Sadiq. Well done for saying it as it is. Yeah, you called it, Sadiq.
No, Sadiq. No. You got it wrong.
Go back.
Let's just go back.
Yeah.
No, it's a bit like when Priti Patel said that we need to be tough on counter-terrorism. Which was
there's too many antis, there's too many counters.
Yeah, too many double negatives.
Anyway, the Conservatives have already turned it into a tack ad, and Sadiq Khan clearly thought he was going out to fight the good fight and ended up with his head in his hands. We'll be back after the break.
Я-то, честно говоря, думал, что он как раз и будет вести себя агрессивно, и будет задавать эти так называемые острые вопросы.
Байден или Трамп?
Байден. Он человек более опытный, он прогнозируемый, он политик старый.
Now look, people who live in glass sort of interview houses have to be very careful.
What's a glass interview house?
Well, you know, as in a stone-throwing glass interview house.
You go and interview someone at Kew Gardens or something like that.
The whole time, with the palm trees.
Lovely,
exactly.
beautiful.
But this is Vladimir Putin criticising the interview that he got from Tucker Carlson because it was too soft. Vladimir Putin is complaining about the sycophancy from a Trump-enamoured former Fox News presenter who came all the way to Moscow to interview him, who sat there for half an hour during Putin's first answer, and then essentially slags him off and says, well, that was a bit of a waste of time.
Yeah, and in that particular bit of the interview, Putin was being asked whether he would prefer to have Trump. And as you could hear, all the Russian speakers, of course, most of you, but also Biden, he said that he would actually prefer to have Biden as president.
Chichornyov Biden.
Well, spasiba, da.
Yeah, exactly.
Moscow, yeah. And he was saying that he would prefer to have Biden. And it was, clearly, presumably Putin is just doing this for precisely that reason that we know, right? Which is he's playing games. He always plays games. He obviously wants Trump, but he also wants to, he knows how it will be internalized in America and elsewhere if he says he wants Trump. So he's just playing the double bluff and saying, I want to have Biden.
I know. I think the weirdest thing about this interview is when you read the transcript, it sounds really sane. It sounds kind of normal. He goes, well, I think, Biden's more old-fashioned, he's a bit more predictable, as if that was the kind of person that Putin really liked. He's a predictable politician. And then he goes on very cleverly to say, obviously, it's the will of the American people, as if he believes in democracy, we will work with whoever.
As a doughty defender of democracy myself, I wouldn't seek to interfere in another country's democratic institutions.
I'm happy just interfering in my own.
And I've got that down, by the way.
I've got that done. And so here he is, sort of saying he prefers Biden to Trump, and here he is slagging off Tucker Carlson for not asking robust enough questions. And it made us have a sort of discussion, didn't it, about who you'd really want to interview now in the world, because the game has changed, the rules have changed. And, it's the kind of thing, if you go and give a talk, you talk to students, they say, oh, who would you really like to interview? Who's the person you'd most like to interview? And we always used to sort of throw out the big names. Oh, God.
On paper, it should be Putin, right? Like, on paper, it should be.
It should be Putin. It should be Trump. Yeah. It should be the people that you're going to have this robust sort of, accountability, confrontation. Powerful people. And yet, actually, in this day and age, where does an interview get you if they don't actually register any of the questions you are asking or give you anything like a verifiable answer?
Well, that's the thing, right? The reason that the Tucker interview could never, ever have worked for two reasons. One, actually, I think that if you don't speak Russian, interviewing Putin is almost impossible, because then it makes it so much harder to kind of interrupt and kind of have that accountability thing. But
as we saw, yeah,
exactly, because he just, he literally hadn't got a clue what he was saying. Obviously been translated, but it's always delayed. But the other reason, the more important reason, is just because Putin's not playing that game. Not that Tucker was interested in an accountability interview, but just hypothetically, if you were going over there to interview him, the whole point of, and this is why it doesn't work with Trump either, or so many of these people, is that the whole point of a traditional kind of broadcast, inquisitorial, interrogative interview is it's basically a kind of game of logic, right? You're like, I've got my points, logical points A and B, and you have said C and D, and you said this thing in the past, now you're saying this thing now, and look, those things don't match. What do you say to that? And a traditional politician would come up with a reason, or at least try and justify it, whereas people like Trump or Putin will just say, well, I never said that in the first place, or you're taking that so far out of context because you're biased. They'll attack you personally. And so they're playing by different rules.
Yeah, it's like sitting down to a game of chess and then finding that Trump's actually got the yellow bits of Connect 4. And
he's playing backgammon.
He's sort of just putting the Connect 4 things in lots of lines of lots of rows of 4. And you're kind of looking and saying, but that's not what we're doing. Not that it's a game, but this whole idea of just going off on a completely different tangent to your own crowd. And I think we talk a lot about, obviously, polarisation, right? But we've lost a central place in which the truth is held now, which is, if you quote numbers at me, and I can prove that those numbers are false, then you go, oh, I'm sorry, I got those wrong. That doesn't happen anymore.
No.
Right? So, if I said to Trump, actually, you failed to bring down immigration. You literally failed to bring down immigration.
No, that's not true, Emily. That's not true.
And
then what do you say? So, well, it is true.
George Bush brought down, George Bush actually kicked out more people. Obama kicked out more people than you did. If that's your metric, if that's how you measure your success, you've massively failed. But if I said that, and he just said it's not true.
I don't know where you're getting your figures from, Emily.
Yeah.
You're a bit ill-informed. You're badly informed.
So then I guess it throws the question back to us, which is how do we do those interviews?
I think it's really difficult. I mean, you saw on a much sort of smaller scale. When I did Rees-Mogg last week, it sort of shows again, right? Because you ask him a question, which I think is perfectly legitimate, and then the first thing he does, and it's really, I don't know what you think about it. I mean, I find it is uncomfortable. The first thing they do, they come back at you and attack you personally, and there's this kind of feeling of like a slight sort of rush of blood to the head, because it's then how do you engage with it? Do you engage on the substance? Do you try and justify yourself? I think that's a mistake. I think it's a mistake to try. I think you would have done one, like when all of these two new types of politicians came along, I think that was our first instinct. I think now, I think you agree with this, that it just takes you down a terrible kind of rabbit hole.
100%. I think as soon as you understand it's a weapon, that when people say, oh, well, the BBC is this,
you're left wing,
or you're this or that, you just think, oh, gosh, you're really uncomfortable with this line of questioning.
Yes.
Right. So that's what you should do. You should say, I've heard that, you're trying to distract me, let me just try and get to the bottom of what I'm actually asking you here, because you clearly don't like it. And the biggest thing, I mean, it's a bit like somebody going, look at that fly. Don't look at the fly, right? Don't have your eye taken off the ball that you're actually following.
I think that's the only thing, right? I think that you have to realise, and I think that was sort of slightly true in that Rees-Mogg thing, but I think it would be true, say, if we did Trump. I think you have to kind of realise that what you're going to get out of it, or the game you have to play, is not that you're going to get a sort of traditional accountability moment where it's exposed that their logic is wrong, or their knowledge is wrong, or that they've done wrong, because they're just not interested in playing that game. I think the only thing you can do is hopefully reveal something about
let them reveal.
Yeah, something about their personality, or if it's their, I think in Rees-Mogg's case, his reaction to that, and his reaction to that question is quite revealing. And so you're not getting a kind of, and Trump does this sometimes, right? Sometimes if you did Trump, you might get him to say something that was not just outlandish, but sort of revealing of what his thinking was about that particular
Which you could argue is why Tucker Carlson or Brett Baer from Fox think they get more out of Trump from a softball interview, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, Brett Baer, I think, went through, when he's the Fox News anchor, who went through a whole list of people that Trump had slagged off, right? And it's quite funny just hearing an entire list of all the people that used to work for Trump, that he had employed, that he'd brought to his inner circle, who he couldn't bear. And Trump just had to sit through this sort of list of names. And then he didn't actually counter any of that. He said, oh, I had some good people as well. But you end up sort of exposing an inner truth with their help.
Yes.
Which maybe is more efficient.
Or maybe you can imagine a situation in which you're dealing with a fantasist like Putin, or say the Russian ambassador, who the other day said, Mariupol is a better city now because, it's a beautiful city now. And of course, Mariupol completely destroyed, so many people killed, war crimes committed and so on. But I suppose if you were doing that interview and they come at you with this complete lie and untruth and fantastical, ridiculous thing, and if you at least robustly say to them, look, this is complete nonsense, look at this, this and this, they might not accept it. But if you're empowered enough and you're strong enough in your rebuttal and clear, I suppose that at least publicly that serves a purpose, that the truth has been put to them, and people will see, people who care about it will see the truth has been put to them, even if that person doesn't accept it and continues to peddle their lies.
Well, let's not be too down on ourselves, Liz, because one of us really has nailed the accountability interview beyond all recognition.
Oh, really?
I'm going to take you back 15 years ago. This is Taylor Swift on the sofa, the breakfast sofa, with John Sopel.
I love it here. The fans have been so amazing, showing up, wherever we go and bringing me presents and stuff like that. It's been so cool, and I especially love it because they all pronounce my name Taylor here.
Oh yes, okay.
Instead of I'm used to hearing it Tyler. That's how I'm used to hearing it.
Oh, really?
So everyone, when they're outside the radio stations chanting, they're like, Taylor. And it's so pretty.
Sorry, let's just hear John's moment again.
I especially love it because they all pronounce my name Taylor here.
Oh, yes, okay.
Didn't quite manage to even say her name.
That is some incisive questioning.
It
there
was
from John.
really good.
That is quite the moment there.
She was really taken aback, wasn't she?
Sometimes there's what they call a gut question. John really nailed the gut question there.
Yeah. Didn't quite finish the whole name.
No, but that's okay. Look, he was a bit dazzled, wasn't he? I think he may have been a little bit dazzled. Well, she was, clearly, yeah.
And where is she now? Like, he's on Bondi Beach having a great time, but where is she now? Has anyone seen Tyler Swift?
Their careers, I think it's fair to say, have gone in quite separate directions.
Divergent. We'll be back.
We've rinsed him this week. We've absolutely rinsed the
What are we going to do when he's back? It's terrible. Before we go, quite an important story about Ukraine funding. We got through the whole section on Putin without mentioning the Ukraine war. And I think it is important to put this in some sort of context, which is our Foreign Secretary now has written for a US website, The Hill, telling Republicans that they have to send more aid to Kyiv, that they have to turn their back on Donald Trump and actually go and support Ukraine in its existential fight against Putin.
Yeah, and this is part of a wider effort by senior members of the Conservative Party here to try and influence members of the Republican Party to unlock that funding bill, to unlock that $60 billion of Ukraine, which has been bogged down in the House of Representatives in particular by Republican lawmakers.
And we've seen how successfully particularly Conservatives and Republicans have got on in the past, whether it was Thatcher and Reagan, whether, I guess you could say, Blair and Bush. When Blair spoke to Congress, they kind of lapped him up. This time the message from Cameron was pretty stark. He's talked about the US Congress potentially showing the weakness displayed against Hitler, i.e. calling them appeasers. Now, some will have listened to that, others not so much.
Yes, I think it's fair to say that Marjorie Taylor Greene, the Republican firebrand of the right of the Conservative Party, absolute diehard Trump supporter, she does speak for quite a reasonably sized element of the House of Representatives, in particular the Republican part of it. I think it's fair to say that she hasn't taken Lord Cameron's message entirely to heart.
I really don't care what David Cameron has to say. I think that's rude name-calling, and I don't appreciate that type of language. And David Cameron needs to worry about his own country, and frankly, he can kiss my ass.
Firm words there from Marjorie Taylor Greene.
Yeah, a woman who believes in Jewish space lasers and other conspiracy theories, but thinks that David Cameron is calling them rude names.
Like
Back
the smashing of the door
Brilliant.
At the end there.
It sounded like a prison.
It did sound a bit like a prison. I suppose that's what the House is like now. I actually think, but it just shows, right, the extent to which the Republican Party and the Conservative Party, sister parties on paper, used to be quite close. You've just talked about some of the relationships, obviously most notably of all probably between Thatcher and Reagan. Recently, in 2007 party conference, they had John McCain come over to do the sort of international address. This is how close these parties once were. And there is an element of the old school of the Republican Party, people like Mitch McConnell in the Senate and so on, who still have those links.
Quite cross-party. If you remember Barack Obama flipping hamburgers in Downing Street with David Cameron.
Oh yeah, for the leadership,
wives,
for sure.
The leadership. I think the leaders have always been very close. But if you remember those rousing speeches that Blair used to make to both houses, they loved him. The Americans loved Blair. They quite like Cameron. And now you've got this sort of kiss my ass.
Yeah.
God, how far have we fallen?
Well, it's just the Trump wing, right? In the sense that they see Cameron and anyone like Cameron as just exactly the sort of forces against which they've railed in the Republican Party, the old school sort of elite of the Republican
the
Party.
Washington Beltway.
Exactly. They just see Cameron as an extension of that. So the idea that Cameron or whoever is going to actually change any minds with any of these people is for the birds.
We'll be back tomorrow when we've got not one, but two by-election results for you.
And what can we say about John then?
Yeah.
That's the question.
Yeah.
Having had 4 days of, quite frankly, the guy's ego being bruised like a little peach.
Oh, I thought
day
massaged.
Well, you know what? It's impossible to dent that guy's ego, really. Deep down. Absolutely made of steel.
We'll see you tomorrow.
Bye-bye.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.